Sometimes life breaks a man so completely that silence becomes his only companion. For Silas Hart, 8 years of solitude on the Montana plains felt like the only peace he'd ever known. Then one morning, a stranger rode up to his cabin, a young woman with dust on her boots and determination in her eyes. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking words that would change everything. "My name's Clara," she said. "I believe I'm your daughter." Silas had loved a woman once, before the war took everything from him, but he'd never known she carried his child. Now here stood a grown daughter he'd never met, asking him to be the father he'd never learned how to be. How do you build a family when you've forgotten how to trust? And what happens when love finds you in the one place you thought you were safe from it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. Silas Hart had forgotten what it felt like to hear a human voice that wasn't his own. For 8 years, the only sounds that broke the Montana silence were the wind through the pines, the crack of his axe splitting wood, and the occasional snort from his horse, Buck. He'd built his life around that silence, crafted it like a man might build a fortress, deliberate, impenetrable, meant to last. His cabin sat 30 miles past Bitter Mesa, where the prairie rolled into foothills and the nearest neighbor was a memory. He'd chosen the spot for its isolation, a place where the world couldn't find him even if it wanted to. The structure itself was solid, thick logs, chinked with clay and moss, a stone chimney that drew clean, and windows positioned to catch the morning light. Nothing fancy, but it had weathered 8 winters without complaint. Every morning followed the same pattern. Silas would wake before dawn, stoke the fire, and put coffee on to boil. While it brewed, he'd step outside to check on Buck and scan the horizon out of habit, a soldier's habit that 23 years of civilian life hadn't broken. Then he'd sit on his porch with that first cup, watching the sun paint the mountains purple, then gold, then the clear blue of another empty day. He'd built this routine like armor against the past. The war had taken pieces of him he couldn't name, and losing Martha had taken the rest. She'd been the gentle one, the one who could coax words from his stubborn mouth and laughter from his guarded heart. When the fever took her that 3rd winter after his return, it felt like the final lesson in the cost of caring about anything. Martha's wedding ring still sat on the mantelpiece, a thin gold band that caught the firelight each evening. Silas couldn't bring himself to wear it or bury it. It remained there like a sentry, reminding him why walls were necessary, why distance was safer than hope. Some nights he'd catch himself looking at it and remember her laugh, the way she'd hum while cooking, how she'd curl against him during thunderstorms. Then he'd bank the fire and go to bed, pushing those thoughts down where they couldn't hurt him. The land itself had become his companion. He knew every creek that ran through his 160 acres, every stand of timber, every meadow where the elk came to graze. In spring, he'd plant a small garden, potatoes, beans, carrots, things that would keep through winter. Summer meant cutting hay for Buck and gathering wood for the cold months ahead. Fall brought hunting season, when he'd take a deer or elk to supplement the salt pork and canned goods he'd trade for in town twice a year. Town meant Copper Falls, a day's ride south. Silas made the trip in spring and fall, loading his wagon with furs he'd trapped and vegetables he could spare. He'd trade for supplies, exchange pleasantries with the shopkeeper, and ride back home the same day. The townsfolk had learned not to expect much conversation from the mountain man. He was polite but distant, a ghost who appeared twice yearly and vanished back into the wilderness. Those rare interactions reminded him how rusty his social skills had become. Words felt clumsy in his mouth, like trying to work with tools he'd forgotten how to use. He'd answer questions with nods when possible, keep transactions brief, and count the miles until he was back in his sanctuary of silence. Buck was his only real companion, a sturdy bay gelding with patient eyes and an even temperament. The horse had been with him for 6 years, purchased from a rancher who'd grown too old for riding. Buck seemed to understand the need for quiet, never nickering without cause, content to graze and doze in the sun. Sometimes, Silas would talk to him while working, not conversation exactly, more like thinking out loud, with an audience that wouldn't judge or expect answers. The cabin's interior reflected its owner's practical nature. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking crane and iron pot for meals. A simple table and 2 chairs, though the second chair hadn't been used in years, occupied the center of the room. His bed was tucked in the far corner, covered with quilts Martha had made during their brief marriage. Shelves lined the walls, holding books he'd read countless times, tools and supplies. Above the mantelpiece, beside Martha's ring, hung his army discharge papers and a daguerreotype of his unit taken before Gettysburg. Most of those faces belonged to boys who'd never made it home. Silas rarely looked at the photograph anymore, but he couldn't bring himself to put it away. Some burdens you carried not because you wanted to, but because forgetting felt like betrayal. His days held a meditative quality born of repetition and solitude. Chopping wood became a rhythm that cleared his mind. Tending his small garden connected him to the earth's cycles. Hunting required patience and awareness that kept him sharp. Winter evenings found him reading by firelight, working on simple repairs, or just sitting in the silence he'd learned to love. The war had taught him that chaos could erupt without warning, that everything solid could crumble in an instant. This controlled existence felt like victory over that randomness. Here, he decided what happened and when. No orders to follow, no battles to fight, no people to lose. The price was loneliness, but loneliness couldn't ambush you, or break your heart, or demand more than you had to give. Sometimes, on clear nights, he'd sit outside and look at the stars. Out here, away from any town's glow, the sky spread like a vast canvas dotted with pinpricks of light. Martha used to say the stars were holes in heaven's floor, letting divine light shine through. He'd stopped believing in heaven after watching good men die in Virginia mud, but the stars remained beautiful regardless of what they meant. Weather was his only unpredictable companion. Mountain storms could turn violent without warning, bringing hail that could kill a man caught in the open or snow that buried everything in white silence. Silas had learned to read the signs the way clouds built over distant peaks, how the wind shifted before a storm, the particular weight of air that meant trouble coming. He respected the weather's power while refusing to let it control his life. Winter was the hardest season, not for the cold or isolation, but for the way darkness stretched the days thin. By December, night fell before 4 o'clock, leaving long hours to fill with firelight and memories. Those were the times when loneliness crept closest, when the silence felt heavy instead of peaceful. He'd learned to combat it with projects carving wooden bowls, mending harness, reading the same books that had comforted him through previous winters. Spring always felt like resurrection. The snow would begin melting in March, creating a symphony of running water, as every creek and stream swelled with runoff. Wildflowers would carpet the meadows in waves of color-yellow buttercups, purple lupine, white mountain laurel. The deer would emerge from their winter refuges, and the eagles would return to nest in the high cliffs. Those first warm days reminded Silas that life persisted despite everything, that the world renewed itself with patient indifference to human suffering. He'd grown comfortable with his status as a hermit, even proud of it in a way. While other men his age worried about politics and money and what their neighbors thought, Silas had stripped life down to its essentials. Food, shelter, safety, and the kind of peace that comes from expecting nothing from anyone. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was sustainable in a way happiness had never been. That was the life Clara's arrival shattered in the space of a single sentence. Standing there in her dusty traveling dress, young and determined and claiming kinship he'd never imagined possible, she represented everything he'd spent 8 years avoiding. Connection, responsibility, the terrible vulnerability of caring about another human being. But as she spoke those words, "I believe I'm your daughter," Silas felt something shift inside his carefully constructed world. Not collapse exactly, but a trembling, like the first crack in ice before spring thaw. And despite everything he'd learned about the danger of hope, he found himself looking into her eyes and seeing something he'd thought was lost forever: the possibility of family. Silas stared at the young woman for a long moment, his coffee growing cold in his hands. She couldn't be more than 22 or 23, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes the color of storm clouds. Something about her face tugged at his memory, but he couldn't place it through the shock of her words. "Your daughter," he repeated, his voice rusty from disuse. "Miss, I think you might have the wrong man." Clara reached into a worn leather satchel hanging from her saddle horn. "My mother's name was Rebecca Morrison. She said you knew her in Kansas before the war, before you shipped out with the Missouri volunteers." The name hit him like a physical blow. Rebecca, sweet, laughing Rebecca with her quick wit and gentle hands. He'd been 22, she 19, and they'd had 3 months together before his unit got orders to move east. 3 months of stolen moments, secret meetings, promises made with the breathless certainty of youth. He'd planned to come back for her after the fighting ended, but the war had gone on longer than anyone expected, and when he finally returned to Kansas, her family had moved west. "Rebecca Morrison," he said carefully. "I remember her. She remembered you too, every day until she died." Clara's voice carried a weight that made him look up sharply. "She never married, Mr. Hart. Raised me alone in Oregon, working as a seamstress and taking in laundry. Said my father was a good man who went off to fight and never came home." The words twisted in his chest. He'd tried to find Rebecca after the war, had ridden back to her father's farm, only to find strangers living there. The neighbors said the Morrisons had headed for Oregon Territory, but the trail was months cold. He'd given up searching and drifted north to Montana, carrying the guilt of another promise broken by circumstance. Clara pulled an envelope from her satchel, yellowed with age and worn soft at the edges. "She made me promise to bring you this if anything happened to her. Consumption took her last winter." These are her words, not mine. Silas set down his coffee and took the letter with hands that trembled slightly. His name was written across the front in Rebecca's careful script, though the ink had faded to brown. Inside, he found 2 pages covered in the same handwriting, along with a small photograph. The photograph showed Rebecca holding a baby Clara, he realized. Rebecca looked older than he remembered, but her smile was the same one that had brightened his young world. His throat tightened as he began to read. "My dearest Silas," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and our daughter has found you at last. I pray that life has been kinder to you than it was to me, though I suspect you carry your own sorrows as I carried mine. I never told you about Clara because I didn't know how to find you after the war ended. Your unit was scattered, and no one could tell me where you'd gone or if you'd survived. I waited for 2 years, hoping you'd come back to Kansas as you promised. When my father decided to move the family west, I had to choose between staying and hoping, or going and protecting our child from scandal. I chose our daughter. I told everyone her father had died in the war, which wasn't entirely a lie since the man I loved seemed to have disappeared from the world. I raised her as best I could, working whenever I could find employment, teaching her to read and write and be strong. She has your eyes, Silas, and your stubborn streak, though I hope she inherited some of my practical sense as well. I told her about you when she was old enough to understand. Not everything. I spared her the details of how much I loved you and how much it hurt when you didn't return. But I told her you were a good man, caught in circumstances beyond your control. I told her that if she ever found you, you would know her as your own. Clara has your determination and my restlessness. She's been talking about finding you since she turned 18. I made her promise to wait until after I was gone, partly because I was selfish enough to want to keep her with me, and partly because I wasn't sure what she might find. A man can change a great deal in 20 years. If you're reading this, she found the courage to seek you out, despite my warnings about disappointment. I hope you'll be kind to her, even if you can't be the father she's always imagined. She's had precious little kindness in her life, and she deserves better than the world has given her so far. I never stopped loving you, Silas Hart. That may not matter to you now, but I wanted you to know. Our daughter is the best thing I ever did with my life, and she exists because we loved each other once, however briefly. Take care of her, if you can. She's stronger than she looks, but she's also more fragile than she'd ever admit, and perhaps, if there's room in your life for family, she can take care of you too. With all my love, then and now, Rebecca. Silas read the letter twice, his hands shaking by the time he finished. Rebecca had loved him all those years, raised their daughter alone, and died without ever knowing what had become of him. The weight of that knowledge settled on his shoulders like stones. He looked up to find Clara watching him intently, her face carefully neutral despite the tension in her posture. "She never knew you'd gone to Montana," she said quietly. "I found your name on some old army records in Jefferson City. Took me 3 months to track you this far." 3 months. He folded the letter carefully, his mind reeling. "You've been looking for me for 3 months. Longer than that, really. Started searching when Mama got too sick to stop me." Clara's voice stayed steady, but he caught the slight tremor that suggested tears held back by force of will. "She made me promise not to expect too much, said you might have another family by now, or might not want reminders of the past." Silas thought of Martha's ring on the mantelpiece, of the 8 years he'd spent building walls against exactly this kind of disruption. But looking at Clara, at his daughter, he saw Rebecca's courage in the set of her jaw and something that might have been his own stubbornness in the way she met his eyes without flinching. "I had a wife," he said finally. "She died 6 years ago. Fever. No children." Clara nodded, though he thought he saw relief flicker across her face. "I'm sorry for your loss. Mama always said, losing someone you love changes everything about how you see the world. Your mama was right about a lot of things." He looked down at the letter again, then at the photograph of Rebecca with their baby. "Clara." "Yes, sir? Would you like some coffee? You've ridden a long way, and it's getting cold out here." She smiled then, and it was Rebecca's smile reflected in a younger face. "I'd like that very much." As he led her toward the cabin, Silas felt the first cracks appearing in the careful structure of his solitary life. Everything he'd built to protect himself from pain was crumbling in the face of this one incontrovertible truth. He had a daughter, and she had found him at last. The question now was whether he still remembered how to be human enough to deserve her. Inside the cabin, Clara's presence seemed to fill every corner with unfamiliar energy. Silas moved carefully around her as he poured coffee, hyper-aware of another person in his sanctuary for the first time in years. She stood near the fireplace, studying the photographs and keepsakes on the mantelpiece with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a stranger's life through objects. "This was your wife?" she asked, gesturing toward the small daguerreotype of Martha that sat beside the wedding ring. "Martha, yes." The words felt awkward in his mouth, as if he'd forgotten how to speak about personal things. "Good woman, patient with an old soldier's ways." Clara nodded, then her gaze moved to the silver locket hanging around her own neck. She touched it unconsciously, a gesture that spoke of long habit. "Mama left me this. It was the only thing of value she owned." She unclasped the locket and held it out to him. "There's something inside you should see." Silas took the delicate piece, noting how his rough hands dwarfed the intricate silverwork. The locket was old but well cared for, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. He pressed the tiny catch, and it opened to reveal a miniature photograph, a baby with serious eyes and dark hair, unmistakably the child from Rebecca's letter. "That's me at 6 months old," Clara said softly. Mama carried it everywhere. Said it reminded her that some beautiful things could come from heartbreak. The image blurred as Silas stared at it. This tiny face had grown into the young woman standing before him, shaped by years he'd known nothing about. The weight of missed time birthdays uncelebrated, scraped knees uncomforted, bedtime stories untold, settled over him like a physical ache. "She was beautiful," he said, closing the locket carefully and handing it back. "You both were." Clara fastened the chain around her neck again, her movements precise, despite the tremor in her hands. "She worked so hard, Mr. Hart, took in washing, sewed dresses for ladies in town, cleaned houses when times got desperate, all so I could go to school, learn to read properly. She wanted better for me than what she'd had." The formal address stung more than Silas expected. Mr. Hart, as if he were a stranger she'd just met instead of the father she'd travelled months to find. But what else could she call him? He'd earned no intimacy, no claim to the title that should have been his by rights. "What did she tell you about me?" he asked, settling into his usual chair and gesturing for her to take the one across from him. The unused chair creaked under her weight, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the cabin's familiar quiet. Clara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup he offered, seeking warmth or courage, or both. "That you were kind, that you made her laugh. She said you had gentle hands for such a big man, and that you never talked down to her like some men did." She paused, studying his face as if trying to match it with the young soldier from her mother's memories. "She said the war changed you, like it changed everyone who came back, made you serious in a way you hadn't been before. But she believed you were still good underneath, still the man who'd promised to come back for her." Silas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I did try to find her. After the war ended, I rode back to Kansas, but her family had moved. Nobody knew where. I know. She always hoped you'd tried." Clara's voice held no accusation, only a sadness that seemed too old for her years. "She used to say that some promises get broken by the world, not by the people who made them." They sat in silence for a moment, the cabin's familiar sounds, the settling logs, the tick of the mantel clock, the whisper of wind through the chinks forming a backdrop to this impossible conversation. Silas found himself studying Clara's profile when she turned to look out the window, noting the strong line of her jaw that might have come from him and the graceful way she held her. Shoulders that was pure Rebecca. "What made you decide to find me now?" he asked finally. Clara set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "Mama got sick last fall. Consumption, like I said. She fought it longer than most, but by Christmas we both knew she wasn't going to recover." Her voice stayed steady, but Silas caught the slight hitch that betrayed deeper emotion. "Near the end, when the pain got bad, she'd talk about you. Wonder if you were happy, if you'd found peace after everything you'd been through. Said she hoped you had someone to take care of you." She looked directly at him then, and he saw Rebecca's determination mixed with something fiercer. "After she died, I realized I was the only person left who remembered you the way she did. Everyone else from Kansas is scattered or gone. I thought maybe you should know she never stopped believing you were a good man, even when you disappeared from her world." The simple statement hit harder than any accusation could have. Silas had spent 23 years carrying guilt about Rebecca, assuming she'd moved on, found someone else, forgotten the young soldier who'd made promises he couldn't keep. To learn she'd remembered him kindly, had spoken of him with love. Even as she died, it shifted something fundamental in how he saw his own past. "She was wrong about one thing," he said quietly. Clara's eyebrows rose in question. "I'm not a good man anymore. Haven't been for a long time. The war took that away, and losing Martha finished what was left. I came up here to get away from people because people deserve better than what I've got left to give." "Mama said you might say something like that." Clara's tone held no judgment, only the patience of someone who'd thought through this conversation many times. She said men who'd been through what you had sometimes forgot the difference between being damaged and being worthless. The observation was so perfectly Rebecca, gentle but uncompromising, that Silas almost smiled despite the pain in his chest. "Your mother always did see things clearer than most." She also said that maybe finding each other again would be good for both of us. That you might need family as much as I do. Clara's honesty was disarming in its simplicity. She wasn't asking him to be the father she dreamed of, wasn't demanding explanations for 23 years of absence. She was just suggesting that two lonely people who shared blood might find some comfort in acknowledgement. "I don't know how to be anybody's father," he admitted. "Never learned, never tried. You're grown now anyway, you don't need an old hermit telling you how to live." "Maybe not," Clara agreed. "But maybe I need to know where I came from. And maybe you need to know that some part of your life created something good, even if you weren't there to see it happen." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending a shower of pine needles across the porch. The sound reminded Silas how far they were from anywhere, how completely alone they were in this conversation that was reshaping everything he thought he knew about his own story. "You can stay," he said finally, the words feeling strange and necessary at the same time. "Tonight, anyway. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." Clara's smile was small but genuine. "Thank you. I'd like that." The evening routine that had sustained Silas for 8 years felt clumsy and strange with Clara watching. She offered to help as he prepared a simple supper of bacon, beans and cornbread, but he found himself fumbling with familiar tasks under her gaze. His movements, usually efficient from years of practice, became self-conscious and awkward. "I can cook," Clara said after watching him struggle with the skillet for the 3rd time. "Mama taught me early," said a woman needed to be able to feed herself and anyone else who might need feeding. Silas stepped aside gratefully, watching, as she took over with quiet competence. Her movements were economical and sure, developed through necessity rather than choice. She adjusted the heat under the beans, tested the cornbread with a practiced finger, and somehow made the simple meal look more appetizing than his usual solitary efforts. "You lived alone with her your whole life?" he asked, settling at the table while she worked. "Mostly. There was a man named William who came courting when I was about 15. Nice enough fellow, owned a small farm outside Salem. Mama seemed to like him well enough, and I thought maybe she'd finally have someone to share the burden." Clara's voice carried a note of old disappointment. "But when he started talking about marriage, asking about my father, Mama got distant. Told him she wasn't ready to remarry, that she had responsibilities to consider. He kept pressing, said he'd be happy to take on another man's child as his own, and that's when she sent him away for good." She turned from the stove to look at Silas directly. "I was angry with her for a long time after that. Couldn't understand why she'd choose loneliness over companionship, especially when William seemed genuinely fond of both of us. It wasn't until she got sick that she explained it properly. What did she say? That she'd already given her heart completely once, and it didn't seem fair to offer William only the pieces that were left." Clara's tone was matter-of-fact, but Silas caught the underlying sadness. She said some people only love deeply once in their lives, and trying to force it a second time just made everyone miserable. The observation stung because it hit too close to home. Silas thought about Martha's ring on the mantelpiece, about the careful distance he'd maintained even in his marriage, keeping the deepest parts of himself locked away. Martha had deserved better than the guarded affection he'd been able to offer, and perhaps Rebecca had been wise enough to spare William. The same half-hearted commitment. "She loved you," Clara continued, spooning beans onto 2 plates. "Even after all those years, even knowing you might never come back or might have forgotten her entirely. Sometimes I thought it was romantic, this grand love story that lasted decades. Other times I thought it was just sad, all that devotion spent on a memory." "And now?" Silas asked quietly. Clara set the plates on the table and took the seat across from him. "Now, I think maybe love isn't something you control. Maybe it just happens to you, and then you have to decide what to do with it." They ate in relative silence, the weight of 23 years of separation hanging between them. Silas found himself stealing glances at Clara, noting small details that connected her to Rebecca or to his own scattered memories of family. The way she broke her cornbread into small pieces before eating it. How she kept her left hand flat on the table while she ate, a gesture of unconscious courtesy. The careful way she chewed, as if savoring food had been a learned behavior rather than a given. "Tell me about Oregon," he said finally, wanting to fill the quiet with something safer than memories of love and loss. "Different from here. More rain, more green. Mama found work in Salem when I was small. There were enough well-off families to keep her busy with sewing. We lived in a boarding house at first, then rented a little room above Mrs. Peterson's bakery." Clara's face softened as she remembered. "I loved the smell of bread baking every morning. Mrs. Peterson used to slip me day-old pastries when Mama wasn't looking, said a growing girl needed more than beans and cornbread. She was kind to us when kindness wasn't common for women in our situation. What situation was that? Unwed mother and bastard daughter. The blunt words carried no self-pity, only the weary acceptance of someone who'd learned early that the world could be unkind to those who didn't fit its expectations. People talked, especially at first. Mama held her head high and worked twice as hard as anyone else, and eventually most folks found something else to gossip about. Silas felt anger rise in his chest, not at Clara, but at the circumstances that had forced Rebecca to bear judgment for his absence. That shouldn't have been your burden to carry. Maybe not, but it was what we had. Clara met his eyes steadily. Mama never acted ashamed of me, never made me feel like I was something to hide. That mattered more than what strangers thought. After supper, Clara insisted on washing the dishes while Silas tended the fire. He found himself watching her move around the cabin, noting how she adapted to the unfamiliar space with quiet efficiency. When she reached for the dish towel hanging near the stove, her sleeve rode up enough to reveal a long scar across her forearm. "What happened there?" he asked, nodding toward the mark. Clara glanced down at her arm, then pulled the sleeve back into place. "Accident when I was 16. Mama was teaching me to use her sewing machine, and I got careless. Caught my arm on a piece of broken metal when I fell. Looks like it was deep enough. Mama stitched it herself, couldn't afford a doctor for something that wasn't life-threatening." Clara's voice held no bitterness, only the practical acceptance of someone who'd learned early that luxury and necessity were different things. Healed clean enough, just left that reminder to be more careful. As night fell outside the cabin windows, Silas realized they'd need to address sleeping arrangements. The cabin had only one bed, and while he could sleep on the floor without complaint, offering hospitality to his daughter shouldn't require her discomfort. "You take the bed," he said, when Clara began glancing around uncertainly. "I've got blankets enough for the floor, and I've slept in worse places. I don't want to put you out of your own bed." "You're not putting me out. You're my guest." He paused, the word feeling strange on his tongue. "You're my daughter." Clara nodded slowly, accepting both the bed and the acknowledgement with equal grace. "Thank you. For the bed, and for letting me stay." As she prepared for sleep behind the blanket he'd hung for privacy, Silas settled on his makeshift bed near the fire. The cabin felt different with another person in it, smaller but somehow warmer, filled with the soft sounds of someone else breathing and moving in the darkness. For the first time in 8 years, Silas' heart fell asleep to the knowledge that he wasn't alone in the world. Silas woke before dawn as always, but for the first time in years he lay still instead of rising immediately. The sound of another person breathing in his cabin felt foreign yet oddly comforting, like a half-remembered song from childhood. Clara slept quietly behind the hanging blanket, her presence transforming the familiar space into something new and uncertain. When he finally rose to stoke the fire and prepare coffee, he moved more carefully than usual, conscious of disturbing her rest. The routine that had anchored his solitary mornings for 8 years now felt like an intrusion on her sleep. He found himself measuring coffee by sight, rather than the familiar rattle of beans, closing the stove door with deliberate quiet, even stepping more softly on the worn wooden floor. Clara stirred as the coffee began to brew, and he heard the rustle of blankets being arranged. "Good morning," came her voice, still thick with sleep but determinedly cheerful. "Morning," he replied, then added awkwardly, "Coffee's nearly ready." She emerged from behind the blanket, fully dressed, her hair braided back neatly. Silas wondered how early she'd awakened to prepare herself so completely before greeting the day. It spoke to a lifetime of careful self-presentation, of never being caught unprepared or vulnerable. "I can help with breakfast," she offered, moving toward the kitchen area. No need, simple enough for one person. But Clara was already pulling ingredients from his shelves, examining the contents with practiced eyes. Mama always said breakfast was the most important meal of the day. Said it set your mind right for whatever troubles might come. She began mixing batter for pancakes, while Silas sliced bacon, their movements developing an awkward rhythm around each other in the small space. Twice they reached for the same utensil, their hands brushing briefly before one stepped back with murmured apologies. The casual intimacy of shared cooking felt both natural and strange, like putting on clothes that almost fit. "How long are you planning to stay?" Silas asked, as they worked, trying to keep his tone neutral despite the complexity of his feelings about the answer. Clara paused in her stirring. "I hadn't thought that far ahead. Honestly, I spent so much energy just finding you that I didn't make plans for what came after." She looked up at him with Rebecca's direct gaze. "How long would you be comfortable with me staying?" The question was fair and reasonable, but it forced Silas to confront emotions he'd been avoiding since her arrival. Part of him wanted her to leave immediately, to restore his carefully constructed solitude before he grew too accustomed to companionship. But another part, a part he'd thought dead and buried, felt desperate at the thought of watching her ride away, leaving him alone with the knowledge of what he'd lost. "I don't rightly know," he admitted. "This is all new territory for me." "For me too." Clara returned to her, mixing with focused attention. "I thought I'd prepared myself for any reaction you might have. Anger, rejection, indifference. I didn't prepare for kindness." "Is that what this is?" She tilted her head, considering. "You let me stay the night. You shared your food and gave me your bed. You didn't send me away when you could have." Her voice softened. "After growing up as the woman nobody wanted, and the child nobody planned for, yes, this feels like kindness." The casual way she described her circumstances, as if being unwanted was simply a fact to be acknowledged rather than a wound to be nursed, reminded Silas painfully of Rebecca. Both women had faced hardship with their chins up and their dignity intact, refusing to seek pity for circumstances beyond their control. After breakfast, Clara asked if she could see more of his land. Silas found himself agreeing despite his usual preference for solitary morning walks. They set out together, Buck trailing behind them like a patient chaperone, as Silas showed her the boundaries of his small kingdom. "It's beautiful here," Clara said as they crested a small ridge that offered views across the valley. "I can see why you chose it." "Chose it for the isolation," Silas replied. "Seemed like the safest choice at the time." "And now," he looked at her profile as she gazed, across the mountains, noting how the morning light caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair. "Now I'm wondering if safe and good are the same thing." They walked on in comfortable quiet, following game trails that Silas had memorized over the years. Clara moved easily across the rough terrain, her practical boots and split-riding skirt allowing her to navigate obstacles without complaint. She'd grown up working, he realized, not sitting in parlors learning needlework and watercolors. "What would you have done if you hadn't found me?" he asked, as they paused beside a creek running high with snowmelt. "Gone back to Oregon, I suppose. Found work somewhere, maybe tried to set up my own sewing business." Clara knelt to splash cold water on her face, the gesture unself-conscious and practical. "Mama left me a little money, enough to get started somewhere if I was careful." "But you'd be alone." She stood, drying her hands on her skirt. "I've been alone before." It's not the worst thing that can happen to a person. Her matter-of-fact acceptance of solitude struck him as both admirable and heartbreaking. She'd learned self-sufficiency the hard way, just as he had, but where his isolation had been chosen, hers had been imposed by circumstance. What was the worst thing? He asked quietly. Clara considered the question seriously before answering. Watching Mama die, knowing there was nothing I could do to help her. Knowing that when she was gone, there'd be nobody left in the world who remembered me as a child or cared whether I lived or died. She looked at him directly. That's why finding you mattered so much. Not because I expected you to take care of me, but because I needed to know I wasn't completely alone. The honesty of her answer cut straight through his defenses. Silas understood that particular fear, the terror of being forgotten, of living and dying without leaving any mark on the world. It was the same fear that had driven him to this mountain, though he'd chosen isolation while she'd chosen connection. "You're not alone now," he said, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. "Neither are you." They walked back toward the cabin as the sun climbed higher, the easy silence between them feeling more natural than it had the night before. Silas found himself pointing out landmarks, the lightning-struck pine where eagles nested, the meadow where deer came to drink, the rocky outcrop that provided the best view of approaching weather. Small details of his solitary life that he'd never shared with another person. Clara listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about the wildlife and the changing seasons. Her attention felt different from mere politeness. She seemed to understand that these details mattered to him, that sharing them was his awkward attempt at intimacy. As they approached the cabin, Clara stopped suddenly, her hand reaching instinctively for the locket at her throat. "There's something else I should tell you. About Mama. About why she really sent me to find you." Silas felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. "What is it?" She was worried about what would happen to her stories when she died. Not just about you, but about her parents, her childhood, all the family history I'd never know because she was the only one left who remembered. Clara's fingers worried the locket's chain. "She made me promise to find you so those stories wouldn't die with her. Said every family needed someone to remember where they came from." The weight of that responsibility to be the keeper of memories, the bridge between past and future, settled over Silas like a familiar burden. It was another role he'd never learned to fill, another way he'd failed the people who'd needed him. That afternoon, Clara began sharing the stories her mother had entrusted to her memory. They sat on the cabin's small porch, the spring sunshine warming their faces as she spoke of a world Silas had never known. Existed Rebecca's family, their farm in Missouri before the Kansas move, the grandmother who'd taught Rebecca to sew, and the grandfather who'd carved wooden toys for every child in 3 counties. Great-grandfather Morrison came from Ireland during the potato famine, Clara said, her voice taking on the cadence of a tale told many times. Mama said he arrived in New York with nothing but the clothes on his back and a head full of stubborn pride. Worked his way west, laying railroad track, saved every penny for 3 years until he could buy 40 acres in Missouri. Silas found himself drawn into the narrative despite his usual discomfort with personal history. Clara had inherited Rebecca's gift for storytelling, painting vivid pictures of people he'd never met but who'd shaped the woman he'd loved and the daughter he was still learning to know. The Morrison women were known for their needlework, Clara continued. Mama's grandmother could embroider anything, flowers that looked real enough to smell, birds so detailed you'd expect them to sing. She taught all her daughters and granddaughters, said a woman's hands should always be able to create beauty even when the world around her was ugly. She pulled a small bundle from her satchel, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a square of white linen covered with the most intricate embroidery Silas had ever seen. The design showed a garden scene, with roses and morning glories climbing a trellis, worked in threads so fine they seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Mama made this for her hope chest when she was 16, Clara said, holding the piece so he could see the detail. Before she met you, before everything changed. She showed it to me once, said she'd planned to use it as a pillowcase on her wedding night. Silas touched the edge of the fabric reverently. The stitches were so small, and even they looked more like painting than sewing, each petal and leaf rendered with loving precision. It's beautiful. She was gifted. She was, but she never finished her hope chest. Said after you left, it seemed like tempting fate to plan for happiness that might never come. Clara rewrapped the embroidery carefully. She kept this piece, though. Said it reminded her that she'd once believed in forever. The weight of unlived dreams pressed down on Silas like stones. He thought of all the plans Rebecca had abandoned, the hope chest left incomplete, the wedding that never happened. His absence had cost her more than just companionship. It had stolen her faith in the future. "Tell me about your grandfather," he said, needing to shift away from his own guilt. "The one who carved toys." Clara's face brightened. "Grandpa Thomas, Mama's father. He could make anything from wood whistles, tops, dolls, even a rocking horse for the preacher's children. His hands were always moving, always shaping something. Mama said he carved because it kept his mind quiet. What do you mean? He'd been in the Mexican War when he was young, saw things that never stopped troubling him. Carving gave him something peaceful to focus on when the memories got too loud." Clara's voice carried deep affection. "Mama said that's where she learned that some hurts never fully heal. You just find ways to live around them." The observation hit closer to home than Silas was comfortable with. He'd spent 8 years trying to find ways to live around his own wounds, building routines and walls to contain what couldn't be fixed. Maybe isolation wasn't the only answer. "He made me a music box when I was 7, Clara continued. "A little wooden dancer that spun when you wound the key. I treasured that thing until the mechanism broke when I was 12. Cried for days because it couldn't be fixed. What happened to it? Still have it. The dancer doesn't spin anymore, but she's still beautiful. Mama said some things are worth keeping even when they're broken, because they remind to you that beauty existed, even if it's gone now." As evening approached, Clara helped Silas tend to Buck and prepare another simple meal. Their movements around each other had grown more natural, less punctuated by awkward apologies and careful distance. Silas caught himself appreciating small things, the way she hummed softly while working, how she automatically straightened items that were out of place, the gentle way she spoke to Buck when offering him treats. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Clara said, as they sat down to supper. "About not knowing how to be anyone's father." Silas looked up from his plate, unsure where the conversation was heading. "I don't know how to be anyone's daughter either," she continued. "Never had the chance to learn. But maybe that means we can figure it out together, without worrying about doing it wrong. What would that look like?" Clara considered the question seriously. "Maybe it starts with just being honest with each other. No pretending to feel things we don't, no forcing connections that aren't there yet. Just two people who share blood and see where that leads." The proposal was so sensible, so free of impossible expectations, that Silas found himself nodding. "I can try that." "Good, because I have questions about my family that only you can answer, and I think maybe you have questions too." She was right, though he'd been reluctant to admit it even to himself. 23 years of wondering about Rebecca, about what had happened to the woman he'd left behind, about whether she'd been happy or sad or angry about his absence. Clara represented the only link to those lost years, the only person who could fill in the blank spaces in his understanding of his own life. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "Everything. What you and Mama were like together, what you planned for your future, whether you loved her the way she loved you." Clara's voice remained steady, but he caught the underlying vulnerability. "I need to understand what I came from, who my parents were when they were young and thought the world might give them what they wanted." The request was enormous in its simplicity. She was asking him to remember not just facts, but feelings, to resurrect a version of himself he'd buried along with his youth and optimism. It would mean acknowledging the man he'd been before the war, carved pieces from his soul, before loss taught him that love was just another word for eventual heartbreak. "That might take some time," he said finally. "I'm not going anywhere," Clara replied. "Not unless you send me away." "I won't send you away." The words surprised him with their certainty. Somewhere in the span of 2 days, Clara had become not just a disruption to his solitude, but a presence he'd begun to value. The thought of her leaving, of returning to the empty silence that had once felt like sanctuary, now seemed unbearable. "Then we have all the time we need," she said, and smiled with such genuine warmth that for a moment Silas could see exactly why Rebecca had never stopped loving the memory of what they'd shared. On Clara's 4th morning at the cabin, Silas woke to find her sitting at the table with a second letter in her hands. This one was different from Rebecca's farewell newer paper, different handwriting, and Clara's face was pale as she read it. "What is it?" he asked, noting the tension in her shoulders. Clara looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It came in yesterday's mail when I rode to Copper Falls for supplies, from a lawyer in Salem." Her voice was carefully controlled. "About Mama's estate." Silas poured himself coffee and waited, recognizing the signs of someone struggling with difficult news. "There's more than I thought," Clara said finally. "Much more. Mama had been saving for years, apparently, and she also inherited some property from Mrs. Peterson when the bakery owner died last year. The lawyer says there's enough money to buy land, maybe start a proper business." She set the letter down with hands that shook slightly. "But there's something else. Something Mama never told me." Clara reached into her satchel and withdrew a small wooden box that Silas hadn't seen before. She opened it to reveal a collection of letters tied with ribbon, a few pieces of jewelry, and what appeared to be legal documents. "Mrs. Peterson left me more than just money," Clara said quietly. "She left me a letter explaining things Mama never had the courage to tell me herself." She handed him a single sheet of paper covered in an elderly woman's spidery handwriting. As Silas read, his understanding of the past 2 decades shifted completely. "My dear Clara," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then both your mother and I have passed, and it falls to me to share truths that Rebecca could never bring herself to reveal. Your mother did not spend 23 years pining for a lost love, child, though she wanted you to believe that noble fiction. The truth is far more practical and, I think, speaks better of her character than the romantic story she preferred. Rebecca heard from your father twice after the war ended. The first time was in 1867, when he wrote to say he'd married and would not be returning to Kansas. The second was in 1871, when he sent word through mutual acquaintances that his wife had died and he was moving to Montana Territory. Rebecca could have contacted him then. She knew where he was and had the means to travel if she'd chosen to. But by that time, she'd built a life for herself and for you. She'd learned to stand on her own feet, to provide for her child, to face the world without depending on any man's promises. She chose not to pursue him, Clara, not because she couldn't find him, but because she'd discovered something more valuable than romantic love. She'd found her own strength. The story she told you about eternal devotion was her way of protecting both of you from harder truths. She didn't want you to think less of your father for abandoning you once he knew of your existence, and she didn't want you to think less of her for choosing independence over the uncertain prospect of renewed romance. Rebecca Morrison was not a woman defined by the man who left her. She was a woman who chose her own path and walked it with dignity. I hope you will remember her that way. Your father knows nothing of this letter or of the choices your mother made. Whatever relationship you build with him should be based on who you both are now, not on the ghosts of decisions made decades ago. With love and respect for your mother's memory, Eleanor Peterson. Silas read the letter twice, his hands growing steadier as the implications settled into place. Everything he'd believed about Rebecca's life, about her reasons for never marrying, about the romantic tragedy that had shaped Clara's understanding of her parents, all of it, had been a carefully constructed fiction designed to protect feelings and preserve dignity. She knew he said finally. Your mother knew I was alive, knew I'd married, knew where to find me. Clara nodded, her composure finally cracking. She chose not to. She let me believe you'd disappeared completely rather than tell me you'd simply moved on with your life. But I did try to find her, Silas protested. After Martha died, I thought about looking again, but so much time had passed. I know. Mrs. Peterson's letter explains that too. Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Mama heard about your wife's death through the same connections that told her you'd married. She almost wrote to you then, almost told you about me, but she'd spent 6 years teaching herself that she didn't need rescuing, and she wasn't about to seek comfort from a man who'd already made his choice once. The revelation reframed everything Silas thought he understood about guilt and responsibility. Rebecca hadn't been the abandoned woman pining for her lost love that he'd imagined. She'd been a woman making deliberate choices about her own life, choosing independence over the risk of rejection or the burden of obligation. Why did she send you to find me now? He asked. Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it, because she was dying, and she realized that all her noble independence meant nothing if it left you thinking you'd ruined her life. Mrs. Peterson says Mama's greatest fear at the end was that you carried guilt that didn't belong to you. She pulled out the ribbon-tied letters from the wooden box. These are the letters you never sent. Mrs. Peterson found them among Mama's things after she died. Letters you wrote, and apparently never mailed, probably because you didn't know where to send them. Silas stared at the bundle, recognizing his own younger handwriting on the envelopes. Letters he'd written to Rebecca in the months after the war, full of explanations and apologies and promises he'd had no way to keep. He'd written them as a way of talking to her across the impossible distance, never intending to send them because he'd had no address. How did she get them? You gave them to a mutual friend in Kansas, someone named Thomas Miller, and asked him to forward them if he ever heard news of the Morrison family. He held on to them for 15 years before finally tracking down Mama in Oregon. By then, she'd decided not to respond, but she kept them. Clara untied the ribbon and spread the letters across the table. She read them every year on my birthday. Mrs. Peterson says they meant everything to her because they proved you hadn't just forgotten and moved on, you'd struggled too. Silas picked up one of the letters, noting how the ink had faded and the paper had grown soft from handling. She kept them all these years. Everyone. And when she got sick, she made Mrs. Peterson promised to give them to me along with the truth about her choices. She said I deserved to know that love doesn't always look like sacrifice. Sometimes it looks like having the courage to choose your own path. The weight of 23 years of misunderstanding settled between them. Rebecca had been protecting everyone, Silas from guilt, Clara from disillusionment, herself from the vulnerability of reaching out across years of separation. But her kindness had built their relationship on a foundation of beautiful lies. What does this change? Silas asked quietly. Clara gathered the letters carefully, retying the ribbon with practiced movements. Everything and nothing. You're still my father. I'm still your daughter. But now we both know that finding each other wasn't about correcting some great romantic tragedy. It was just about two people deciding whether they want to be family. She looked at him directly, her eyes clear despite the tears. The question is whether you want me to stay because you feel guilty about the past, or because you actually want me here. The honesty of the question cut straight through every careful justification Silas had been building for the strange comfort he'd found in her presence. Stripped of the romantic narrative of lost love and noble sacrifice, their connection had to stand on its own merits. Two damaged people finding unexpected solace in shared blood and tentative affection. I want you here, he said simply. Not because of your mother, not because of guilt, but because these 4 days have been the first time in 8 years that I've remembered what it feels like to not be alone. Clara's smile was watery but genuine. Good, because I want to stay. Not to fulfill Mama's dying wish or to reunite you with some grand lost love, but because I think maybe we could take care of each other. The truth about Rebecca's choices changed everything between them, but not in ways Silas had expected. Instead of feeling betrayed by the deception, he found himself oddly relieved. The crushing weight of guilt he'd carried for 23 years had lifted, replaced by something more complex, but ultimately more honest respect for a woman who'd chosen her own path and raised their daughter to be strong enough to make her own choices too. Clara seemed equally liberated by the revelation. The careful politeness that had marked their first few days together gave way to something more natural. She moved through the cabin with less hesitation, offered opinions without prefacing them with apologies, and began treating their shared space like a home rather than a temporary shelter. "I've been thinking about what I want to do with Mama's inheritance," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Mrs. Peterson was right, there's enough to buy land, start fresh somewhere." Silas looked up from the harness he was mending, noting the thoughtful expression on her face. "Where were you thinking of going?" "That's just it. I don't know if I want to go anywhere." Clara set down the book she'd been reading and looked at him directly. "I like it here. I like the quiet, the way the mountains look different every day, how you can see weather coming from miles away. I even like the work. There's something satisfying about tasks that have clear beginnings and endings." She paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. "I was wondering if you'd consider having a partner instead of just a temporary visitor." "What kind of partner?" "The practical kind. I have money to contribute, skills you could use, and a willingness to work. This land could support more than just one person if it was managed right. We could expand the garden, maybe add some chickens, improve the cabin." Clara's voice gained confidence as she spoke. "I know you chose this place for solitude, and I wouldn't want to change that if it's truly what you need. But I also think maybe we could build something here together. Not because we have to, but because we want to." Silas set aside his work, considering her proposal seriously. The practical part of him recognized the wisdom in what she suggested. The land could indeed support more ambitious projects with two people working it. Her inheritance would provide resources for improvements he'd never been able to afford alone, and her companionship had already proven valuable in ways he hadn't anticipated. But the deeper question was whether he was ready to commit to sharing his sanctuary permanently, to accepting responsibility not just for Clara's immediate welfare, but for her future happiness and security. Partnership implied obligations, expectations, the possibility of disappointment on both sides. "What if it doesn't work?" he asked quietly. "What if we find out we can't live together peacefully, or you decide mountain life isn't what you want long-term?" "Then we'll figure something else out," Clara replied with the same practical certainty her mother had shown. "But I'd rather try and fail than wonder for the rest of my life what might have been possible." The echo of Rebecca's courage in those words struck Silas deeply. Clara had inherited more than her mother's physical features. She'd inherited the strength to take calculated risks, to choose hope over safety when the potential rewards justified the chance of loss. "There's something else to consider," he said. "Winter up here is harder than anything you've experienced in Oregon. Snow that stays from November to April, temperatures that can kill you if you're not careful, isolation that goes beyond choice and becomes necessity. I know. I've been reading about mountain winters in your books." Clara gestured toward the shelf where his collection of practical guides and survival manuals lived. "It sounds challenging, but not impossible for someone who's prepared. And if you get lonely, Copper Falls is a day's ride in good weather, impossible to reach for months at a time in winter. No neighbors to visit, no social gatherings, no convenient stores or services." Clara considered this seriously. "I've been alone most of my life in one way or another. At least here I'd be alone with family, with purpose, in a place that feels like it could become home." Her answer revealed the depth of loneliness she'd carried, despite growing up in a town surrounded by people. Silas understood that particular isolation, the kind that came from being fundamentally different from those around you, from having experiences that set you apart from conventional society. "There's one more thing," he said, knowing he needed to be completely honest about the challenges she'd face. "I'm not easy to live with. 8 years of solitude have made me set in my ways. I don't talk much. I have particular routines I'm attached to, and there are times when the war still catches up with me in ways that aren't pleasant." "What do you mean?" Silas hesitated, then decided she deserved the full truth. "Nightmares sometimes, days when loud noises or sudden movements put me back in places I'd rather not be. It's better than it used to be, but it's not gone completely." Clara nodded, as if she'd expected something like this. "Mama had difficult days too, especially toward the end. Not from war, but from years of carrying burdens that were too heavy for one person. I learned how to help without making it worse. This might be different. Maybe. But I'd rather deal with honest difficulties than pretty lies." Clara met his gaze steadily. "Besides, you've already seen me at my worst, showing up uninvited, disrupting your peace, crying over old letters. If you can handle that, maybe I can handle whatever challenges you think you bring to the arrangement." Her logic was sound, her commitment seemed genuine, and her presence had already proven more beneficial than burdensome. More importantly, Silas realized he wanted her to stay not just because she was useful or pleasant company, but because she was family in the truest sense, someone who'd chosen to be there despite knowing the costs. "If we do this," he said slowly, "it needs to be a real partnership. Equal say in decisions, shared responsibility for successes and failures, honest communication about problems before they become crises." "Agreed. And if either of us decides it's not working, we need to be able to say so, without it meaning we've failed as family." "Also agreed." Clara's smile was warm but serious. "Should we shake hands on it, or is there some other mountain man tradition for sealing important agreements?" Silas found himself almost smiling at her gentle humor. "Handshake works fine for most things, but this feels like it deserves something more permanent." He got up and went to the chest, where he kept his important papers, his discharge, Martha's death certificate, the deed to his land. From the bottom of the pile, he pulled out a document he'd never expected to use, a form for adding someone to a property deed that he'd obtained years ago when he'd briefly considered taking on a partner for practical reasons. "If we're going to be partners," he said, bringing the form back to the table, "then you should have legal claim to this place. Half ownership, so you can never be thrown off the land, no matter what happens." Clara stared at the document, her eyes wide. "Silas, that's an enormous gesture. Are you sure?" "I'm sure. This land has been my refuge for 8 years, but it was never meant to be my tomb. If we're building something together, it should belong to both of us." The significance of the offer wasn't lost on either of them. Silas was proposing to give Clara not just a home, but security, legal standing, permanent claim to the sanctuary he'd spent years creating. It was the kind of commitment that couldn't be undone casually. The kind of trust that transformed temporary arrangements into lasting bonds. "There's a justice of the peace in copper." "Falls," Clara said quietly. "We could ride down tomorrow, file the paperwork, make it official." "And stop by the general store," Silas added. "If we're going to expand the operation, we'll need supplies for the projects you mentioned. Might as well start planning for next winter while we're at it." The practical details helped ground the moment in reality. They weren't just making emotional promises, they were committing to concrete actions, shared investments, mutual dependence. It felt both momentous and surprisingly natural, like a decision that had been building toward inevitability since Clara first rode up his trail. "One more thing," Clara said as she carefully folded the deed form. "I want to write to the lawyer in Salem, have him transfer Mama's inheritance to an account here in Montana. If this is going to be home, then my resources belong here too." The gesture completed the circle of trust and commitment. By the time they finished their trip to Copper Falls, there, There would be no easy retreat for either of them. They would be partners in the fullest sense, bound by law and mutual investment to make their relationship work. As they prepared for bed that night, Silas felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that reminded him of his younger self, the man who'd once believed in the future enough to make plans and promises. Clara had awakened something in him that 8 years of careful numbness had nearly killed, the willingness to hope for something better than mere survival. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. One written not from obligation or guilt, but from the conscious choice to build a family from the raw materials of blood, affection, and shared determination. The ride to Copper Falls took on the quality of a pilgrimage. Silas and Clara left the cabin before dawn, their saddlebags packed with the legal documents that would transform their tentative arrangement into permanent partnership. The morning air was crisp with the promise of summer, and wildflowers had begun dotting the meadows. They passed Indian paintbrush, wild lupine, and mountain laurel, creating splashes of color against the green backdrop. Clara rode Martha's old mare, a gentle bay named Rosie that Silas had kept more from sentiment than necessity. The horse had been unused for years, but she took to Clara immediately, responding to her confident but gentle handling with obvious pleasure at having purpose again. "Tell me about the justice of the peace," Clara said, as they navigated a particularly rocky section of trail. "Will he ask questions about our arrangement? Judge Morrison, no relation to your mother's family, is practical above all else. Been handling legal matters for this territory for 15 years, seen every kind of partnership and agreement you can imagine." Silas guided Buck around a fallen log, then continued. "He'll want to make sure you understand what you're signing and that there's no coercion involved. But beyond that, he doesn't pry into personal business." Clara nodded, though Silas caught a flicker of nervousness in her expression. What if he thinks it's strange, a young woman suddenly appearing to claim partnership with a hermit? Then he'll think it's strange and file the paperwork anyway, because strange doesn't make it illegal. Silas glanced at her sideways. "Having second thoughts?" "Not second thoughts exactly, more like first-time nerves." Clara adjusted her grip on the reins. "I've never owned land before, never had my name on legal documents that mattered. It feels bigger than I expected it to." "It is big. That's why we're doing it right, with proper paperwork and witnesses." Silas slowed Buck's pace slightly, giving Clara more time to process her feelings. Property ownership means security, but it also means responsibility. Once your name is on that deed, you'll be liable for taxes, bound by local laws, expected to maintain the land according to territorial standards. "Are you trying to talk me out of it?" "No. I'm trying to make sure you understand what you're agreeing to." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I don't want you to wake up 6 months from now feeling trapped by obligations you didn't fully comprehend." Clara was quiet for several minutes, the only sounds their horse's steady rhythm and the whisper of wind through the pines. When she finally spoke, her voice carried new determination. Mama spent 23 years being careful, weighing every decision against the possibility of making mistakes or facing disappointment. It kept her safe, but it also kept her alone. Clara straightened in her saddle. "I don't want to live that carefully. I'd rather take risks on things that matter than spend my life protecting myself from chances I was too afraid to take." The conviction in her voice reminded Silas powerfully of Rebecca, not the cautious woman she'd become after years of single motherhood, but the girl who'd been brave enough to love a soldier heading off to uncertain war. Clara had inherited that courage, refined it through her own experiences of loss and self-reliance. "Then we'll make it official," Silas said. "Full partners, equal stakes, whatever comes." As they crested the ridge that overlooked Copper Falls, the small town spread below them like a collection of toys arranged by a careful child. Smoke rose from chimneys, indicating the breakfast preparations of early rising families. The main street was already showing signs of activity, shopkeepers opening their doors, horses being hitched to wagons, the steady rhythm of a community beginning another day. Silas felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied any approach to populated areas. 8 years of isolation had amplified his discomfort with crowds, even crowds as small as Copper Falls's 200 residents. But Clara's presence beside him provided an unexpected buffer against that anxiety. Having someone to introduce, someone whose needs justified his presence in town, made the social interaction feel less like an invasion and more like a natural part of life. "It's smaller than I expected," Clara said as they began the descent toward the main street. "Small but sufficient for most needs. Judge Morrison's office is above the bank, general store has most of what we'll need for supplies, and Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house makes the best apple pie in 3 counties. Are we staying the night? Depends how long the paperwork takes and what kind of supplies you want to order." Silas guided Buck toward the hitching post in front of the bank. "Might be wise to stay over. Make sure everything's filed properly before we head back." Clara dismounted with the easy grace of someone raised around horses, then stood looking up at the second-story window where Judge Morrison's shingles swayed in the morning breeze. This is really happening. Having doubts? No doubts, just amazement. Clara's smile was bright with anticipation. 6 months ago, I was washing other people's clothes for pennies, wondering how I'd survive after Mama died. Now, I'm about to become a landowner in partnership with my father. Sometimes life changes faster than you can prepare for it. Silas secured Buck's reins and shouldered the saddlebags containing their documents. "Ready?" Clara took a deep breath, touched the locket at her throat in what had become a habitual gesture of courage gathering, and nodded. "Ready." Together, they climbed the narrow stairs that would take them to the next chapter of their shared story. Judge Morrison was exactly as Silas had described, a practical man in his 60s with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen enough human nature to be surprised by very little. His office was sparse but orderly, filled with law books, filing cabinets, and the accumulated paperwork of frontier justice. "Silas Hart," the judge said, rising from behind his desk with genuine warmth. "Haven't seen you in town for what, 8 months? Last time was when you needed that survey confirmation for the tax assessment." "Something like that." Silas removed his hat and gestured toward Clara. "Judge Morrison, I'd like you to meet Clara Morrison. No relation that we know of." "She's my daughter." The judge's eyebrows rose slightly, but he recovered quickly and offered Clara his hand with courtly dignity. "Miss Morrison, a pleasure to meet you. I must say, you're the first family member of Silas's I've had the privilege of meeting. Thank you, sir. I've traveled from Oregon to find my father." Clara's voice carried just the right mixture of respect and confidence. "We'd like to discuss a property matter, if you have time." "Of course. Please, both of you, sit down." Judge Morrison returned to his chair and folded his hands on the desk. "What can I help you with?" Silas pulled the deed paperwork from his saddlebag and laid it on the judge's desk. "I want to add Clara as equal partner to my land holdings. Full ownership rights, legal standing, all of it." Judge Morrison picked up the documents and examined them carefully, his expression growing more serious as he read. "This is a significant change, Silas. Are you certain you understand the implications? Once Miss Morrison's name is on this deed, she'll have equal claim to sell, mortgage, or dispose of the property as she sees fit." "I understand. And Miss Morrison," the judge turned to Clara, "do you understand that accepting partnership in this property means accepting responsibility for taxes, maintenance, and any debts or obligations associated with the land?" "I do, sir. My father and I have discussed the practical implications thoroughly." Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying them both with the careful attention of someone accustomed to evaluating human motivations. "Forgive the personal question, but you two have only recently met. Is that correct?" "About a week ago," Clara confirmed. "But we're family, and we've decided to build something together rather than remain strangers." "May I ask, what prompted this decision?" property partnership is usually the result of long-term relationship building or significant business arrangements. Silas had expected this question and had prepared an honest answer. I've spent 8 years alone on that land, Judge. It's been good for healing old wounds, but it's not much of a legacy. Clara represents the chance to build something lasting, something that might outlive us both. And you, Miss Morrison, what do you hope to gain from this arrangement? Clara was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. I've spent my whole life without roots, sir, moving from town to town, never knowing where I truly belonged. This land, this partnership with my father, it's the first chance I've had to plant something permanent. Judge Morrison nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with their responses. Very well. I'll need to verify the current deed status, prepare the new documents, and arrange for proper witnesses. The whole process should take about 2 hours. We're prepared to wait, Silas said. As the judge began pulling files and preparing paperwork, Clara stood and moved to the window overlooking the main street. Silas joined her, both of them watching the quiet bustle of small-town life below. Second thoughts? He asked quietly. None. Clara's voice was firm. But I keep thinking about Mama, wishing she could see this. She worried so much about what would happen to me after she was gone, whether I'd be able to make my way in the world. I think she'd be amazed to know I found not just my father, but a home and a future. She'd be proud of you. The way you tracked me down, the courage it took to travel so far alone, the strength you've shown in building something new that takes character. Clara turned from the window to look at him directly. We're really doing this. By afternoon, I'll be Clara Hart, property owner, mountain woman. Clara Hart. Silas tested the sound of it. That has a nice ring to it. The judge called them back to his desk, where he'd laid out the new deed documents. Everything appears to be in order. I'll need both of you to sign here, and then I'll call in my clerk and the bank manager to serve as witnesses. As they signed their names to the documents that would bind their futures together, Silas felt a sense of completion he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about property transfer, it was about choosing family, choosing hope, choosing to believe that two damaged people could create something stronger together than either could build alone. When the last signature was completed and witnessed, Judge Morrison shook both their hands solemnly. Congratulations, partners. May your venture bring you both the happiness you're seeking. Walking down the courthouse stairs, Clara slipped her arm through Silas's, the first deliberately affectionate gesture she'd made. Well, partner, she said with a grin that transformed her entire face. What's our first official act as joint landowners? I believe, Silas said, surprised by his own lightness of heart. It's time to celebrate with Mrs. Henderson's apple pie. 3 months later, Silas Hart stood on his porch, watching the sun rise over land that no longer felt like a refuge from the world, but like the foundation of a new one. The cabin had grown by 2 rooms, a proper bedroom for Clara and a larger kitchen where they could work side by side during the long, preserving sessions that marked late summer. The garden had tripled in size, and a chicken coop housed a dozen hens whose eggs provided both sustenance and a small income from sales in Copper Falls. Clara emerged from the cabin carrying 2 cups of coffee, a morning ritual they'd developed that replaced his solitary dawn vigil with something far more satisfying. She'd grown comfortable in work clothes, practical skirts, and sturdy boots that could handle mountain life, but she still wore her mother's locket every day, a connection to the past that had brought them together. The Hendersons are coming up next week to see about commissioning some of your woodwork, she said, settling into the chair they'd built to match his. Mrs. Henderson wants a dining table like the one you made for us, and her husband is interested in those storage chests. Silas nodded, sipping his coffee and thinking about the unexpected direction his life had taken. Clara's business sense had revealed opportunities he'd never considered. His practical furniture, carved during long winter evenings, had found a market among Copper Falls families who appreciated quality craftsmanship. What had been solitary therapy was becoming a modest source of income, and I heard back from the banker about expanding the chicken operation. Clara continued, he thinks there's enough demand in town to support 50 birds, maybe more if we can arrange regular delivery. That's a lot of chickens. It's a lot of opportunity. Clara's smile carried the same determined optimism that had brought her to his door. Between your woodworking and the expanded farming, we could build something substantial here. Something that would support a family. The word family still felt strange and wonderful in Silas's mouth. They'd become that almost without trying, two people who shared morning coffee and evening conversations, who divided chores based on skill rather than tradition, who'd learned to navigate each other's moods and habits with growing affection and respect. There's something else, Clara said, her tone shifting to something more serious. I got a letter yesterday from a woman in Salem, Anna Whitfield. She says she knew my mother years ago and has been trying to track down her family. Silas set down his coffee cup, recognizing the weight of whatever was coming next. Anna's daughter died last year, leaving behind a 10-year-old boy. Anna's too old to raise him properly, and she's been looking for family connections that might help. Clara pulled a letter from her pocket. She wondered if I might consider taking him in, since Mama had spoken of me with such fondness. The proposal hung between them like morning mist, substantial enough to require serious consideration, but delicate enough to dissipate under the wrong kind of attention. What did you tell her? Silas asked carefully. That I'd need to discuss it with my partner. Clara met his eyes directly. This would be a big change, Silas. A child changes everything about how people live, especially out here. What's the boy like? His name is Samuel. Anna says he's quiet, good with his hands, loves books and learning. His father died in a logging accident when he was 6, and he's been living with Anna since his mother passed. She says he's never been any trouble, but he needs more than she can provide. Silas thought about the cabin, about the land, about the life they'd been building together. A child would mean noise, questions, the constant presence of someone who needed care and attention. It would mean the end of their quiet mornings and peaceful evenings. It would mean responsibility for shaping a young life, for providing not just shelter and food, but guidance and love. It would also mean the chance to give a child the kind of stable home neither he nor Clara had known growing up. How do you feel about it? He asked. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her fingers worrying the chain of her locket. Scared, she said finally, but also hopeful. I keep thinking about what Mama always said, that family isn't just about blood, it's about choosing to take care of each other. We chose each other. Maybe Samuel needs someone to choose him too. Silas understood exactly what she meant. Family built from choice rather than obligation might be stronger than the kind that simply happened through biology. They'd proven that much already. Write to Anna, he said. Tell her we'd like to meet Samuel before making any final decisions, but that we're willing to consider it seriously. Clara's smile was radiant. Really? Really? This place is big enough for 3 people, and Lord knows we could use help with all the projects you keep planning. Silas found himself grinning, despite the magnitude of what they were contemplating. Besides, someone needs to carry on the family name when we're gone. As they sat together watching the sun climb higher over their valley, Silas reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a hermit convinced that solitude was his only option for peace. Now he was considering becoming a father figure to an orphaned boy, planning business expansions, and looking forward to decades of shared life with the daughter he'd never known existed. Sometimes life broke you completely, stripping away everything you thought you needed to survive. But sometimes, if you were fortunate enough and brave enough to remain open to unexpected gifts, it put you back together in ways that were stronger and more beautiful than anything you'd lost. Clara reached over and squeezed his hand, her touch warm and certain. Thank you, she said simply. for letting me stay, for choosing family, for believing we could build something good together." Silas squeezed back, thinking of Rebecca's locket and Martha's ring, of the letters he'd never sent, and the love that had waited 23 years to find its proper form. "Thank you for finding me," he replied, "for reminding me that some promises are worth keeping, even when it takes decades to figure out how." In the distance, an eagle soared over their valley, riding the thermals with effortless grace. Silas Hart was no longer a man hiding from the world. He was a father, a boss, partner, and perhaps soon a guardian, a man who'd learned that the greatest courage sometimes meant simply opening your door when love came knocking, however unexpected its form might be.